everybody. My name is Ron Cansler, and we want to welcome you to another episode of Disciple Making Church Podcast. So glad you've decided to join us. My name is Ron. This is Ken Adams. He's the founder and director of Impact Ministries. Thank you so much for being here as we strive, as always, to look at both being and building disciples like Jesus inside the local church. And so, Ken, it's good to see you.
Man, thanks, Ron. Good to be with you, buddy.
Yeah. And so we're excited, as always, to be kind of unpacking some things about disciple making inside the local church. And so today we're going to be really starting a series that's going to be talking about values, and values are so important in our personal life. But Ken, values also are a big part of church life as well.
Man, they really are. And, it's interesting, Ron, that, every church has a mission, or should have a mission, right? Mm-hmm. Which kind of tells us, where we're going, why we do what we do, kind of thing. And then every church ought to have a statement of faith, ought to have a doctrine statement, right? So we ought to have a statement of mission. We ought to have a statement of belief, but we also ought to have a statement of values. And I don't know if you ever considered this or not, but I actually heard somebody say this years ago, that churches rarely divide over mission and they rarely divide over doctrine, but they almost always divide over values. And, it's interesting because for denominations, it's the opposite. So denominations usually split over mission or doctrine, but churches usually split over values. And values are just the things that sort of our philosophy of ministry, or the way we approach doing ministry. And so values are so important, because whenever you have disagreement in your values, it will lead to division in your organization. And so we've just recently done a whole series on values in our church, and we believe that those values are not just true for our church particularly, but for really every disciple-making church. And so we haven't talked a lot about those values in the past, but I think this is going to be a good next several months as we just kind of every month unpack different values of disciple-making churches.
Yeah, Ken, I'm excited about this because in my own life, I know this to be true. It's probably true for you guys as well out there, that if you want to know what someone values, just watch what they do. And so the values are so important that we obviously want to look inside God's Word, look at the life of Jesus. And this sermon series you did was fantastic. As a matter of fact, right now we're going to take just a moment and watch a clip from that sermon.
But these are a few of the values that have determined how we've gone about what we do for the last 34 years, and will continue to determine what we do for as long as we're here as a church, as long as we hold to these values. Let's talk about the first one. So this first one is basically, what does it mean to be culturally relevant? Now, some of you might be thinking, well, isn't every church culturally relevant? Hardly. In fact, what my experience is, and I bet your experience is that there are probably more churches that are not culturally relevant than churches that are culturally relevant. So, well, what does it mean? It's really just a very simple idea. It's not complicated at all. But what it means is this: when we say we have a value to be culturally relevant, is that we want to be a church that actually relates to the culture that we're trying to reach. I mean, what a novel idea, right? That we want to relate to the culture. You say, why is that such a big deal? Because that's exactly what Jesus did. Let me tell you something, is that Jesus related to the culture that he came, that Jesus came for people that were far from God and that were separated from him. And Jesus came in a way that he related to them and he identified with them and he connected with them. And that's exactly what we want to do. You say, what does that mean? So what I'm saying is this, is that what we are trying to do in Coweta County in 2023 is the exact same thing that Jesus did in first century Jerusalem. Now, obviously, we do it different ways. Jesus didn't have a lot of the things. He didn't have the technology we have. He didn't have a lot of the resources we have. So how he did it's different, but what he did, it's the exact same thing. I know you already know this, but let me just make it really clear. You need to understand is that Jesus Christ is the single most culturally relevant minister in all of history. I mean, Jesus spoke their language, wore their clothes, used their buildings. Jesus listened to the same music they listened to. Jesus understood their problems. You know, Jesus did not repel people over and over again. Jesus what? He attracted people. You know what? Listen to this. Is that when Jesus did ministry, as Jesus went over a period of 3 years, did the people following him increase or decrease? Now, let me just ask you a question. How come more churches in our country and actually around the world are decreasing rather than increasing?
So, Ken, that's a good word right there. And ultimately, we see that, when we talk about being culturally relevant, that can be sometimes kind of a word that brings up some different thoughts, some different ideas, some different philosophies. And so can you speak to that just for a minute?
Yeah. So, the value of a church being culturally relevant is something that for a lot of leaders and a lot of folks in church life, it can be confusing, it can be misleading, and I think a lot of times these terms like being seeker driven or seeker targeted and contemporary and all these things, they can mean a lot of different things. But here's what I would tell you, Ron, is that there is, whatever we debate about a church, there's nobody in history that was more culturally relevant than Jesus.
That's true.
Jesus was the most relevant minister in history. He completely identified with the culture he was trying to reach.
Yeah.
And so, we say this all the time, is that Jesus is our model, isn't he?
Yeah, so I think what I hear you saying is that if it was important for Jesus to be, to relate to his culture, to be culturally relevant, that it should be important to us as well.
Man, it should be a value, not just in the way we go about a worship service.
Right.
It should be a value in everything we do, right?
Yeah. So if that's true, then, what are some examples from the life of Jesus that you maybe can flesh out for us a little bit where you see this to be true?
Yeah. Well, I think, the first example that comes to my mind is a passage in the book of Mark, where Jesus is identifying with tax collectors and sinners. And there's a passage where he's at Matthew's house or Levi's house, and it clearly says that Jesus was connecting with and he was relating to people that were far from God, but he was obviously speaking their language. He was obviously relating to their culture. So they were not being turned off or seeing Jesus as being unrelatable. They were actually seeing Jesus as being one of them, one of the culture. Yeah. And so what he didn't do is that he didn't compromise. He didn't compromise the truth at all in order to be able to connect with the people that he was trying to reach.
Yeah, I love that. Recently, I was reading something you had written, and you had a quote in there, and so I want to get it right here. You said, Jesus' cultural relevance was based on a commitment to steadfast truth. So what exactly, how did Jesus not compromise on the truth, but be culturally relevant?
Yeah, great question. And I think this is where people struggle, right? Because a lot of times people think that to be relevant to the culture, you have to compromise.
Yeah.
And if anything, Jesus shows us completely the opposite, right?
That's right. Because
Jesus is a great example of how we need to be culturally relevant, but never compromising the truth. We need to have an uncompromising message
right.
to a constantly changing world. And so Jesus, I think, is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Jesus was able to demonstrate grace and truth at the same time,
Yeah, I mean, you don't become known as a friend of sinners unless you're reaching into the culture and spending time with them. So I guess the big question then, if Jesus was culture relevant and we're trying to do it like Jesus did, his strategy, so if it's part of his strategy, I mean, it should be important to us as well, right?
I would agree.
Yeah. So I don't know, what are some ways maybe it can be seen inside the local church? How can a local church be culturally relevant?
Yeah. Well, and I think there are a lot of different ways. Again, some people make the mistake of thinking it's just about the worship service or it's just about the music.
Yeah.
But really, it's not. It's about more than that. It's about the look of the facility. It's about the way people dress. It's about the way people. The way people talk, the language, is it a language that people relate to, or does it sound like it's coming out of, another century somewhere, years ago? I do think it involves music, and I think it involves worship. And, I always use this example, Ron, that, if I get into most people get into their car and they turn on the radio station, they're probably, and this is probably going to get a lot of people upset, but they're probably not turning on music that comes from the 17 or 1800s. They're probably, and not that music's not good, right, and that music has a place, and that music still speaks to us, but it speaks to a believer differently than it speaks to a non-believer. And we have to remember that our mission is to make disciples of all nations. Yeah. And so that requires, in my opinion, that we do it the way Jesus did, and that means being able to relate to the culture without compromising the truth.
Yeah. So I think what I hear you saying is that, Jesus very much understood he had to meet people where they were so he could bring them to where they needed to be.
You can't say any better than that.
Yeah. I mean, so with that said, it's not a either or, it's a both and, and so he taught the truth. I do think it's interesting that, maybe many of you have even been on a mission trip, right? And you're going to go to another country and you begin to plan, so what are some of the things, like, what do we plan for when we go on another trip?
Yeah. It's a great thing. I mean, here you are, you're our global pastor here at our church. And so you're in countries, a lot of different places at different times of the year. And, when you go to another country, we recently went to Africa, and, we didn't ask them to become like us. We tried to identify with them. And so, it involves everything from the food that you eat to the customs that you observe and the things that you do. And so we tried to identify with their culture, and even some of the illustrations and things that we say have to be filtered through, does this make sense to them? Yeah. Does this connect to them? Right. And so it's a really and truly, Ron, it's a big, wide category of things that involve, but I think more than anything, it is just this value, right? It's just saying we want to identify, I think if I were going to, to another country, I would not go to that country and expect them to understand all of North American culture or all of American culture. I would expect them to be true to their culture, right? And I also think that sometimes in our country and in our churches, when people walk through the doors of a lot of churches in the country, it's like going back into a time warp. And it's like going back into a day at a time that nobody can relate to. That's right. Because the music, the dress, the language, the things that they do are not necessarily wrong, but they're just not relating
Yeah.
to where people are at. And therefore, that can become a barrier to communicating and connecting with the gospel. And that's what ultimately we want to see happen, right?
Yeah. So that value of connecting with your culture, you're really saying, hey, we have an unchanging message.
Yeah.
And we don't want to create any more stumbling blocks that are already there. Like, we don't want to go out of our way. Just kind of dovetailing on what you talk about going overseas. I mean, we train people to go out, and I think that's what the local church is supposed to do as well, is that we train them to, one, meet the people where they are, to understand their language, to understand their traditions, to try to figure out what's happening in their lives so that they can then share an unchanging message. It would be kind of ridiculous to go and take American culture to another culture. And so if you're watching here today, maybe you're starting to think a little bit about your own church, your own situation, and, maybe God's revealing to you that you have a culture inside your church as well as outside.
Wouldn't you think this would be important that if you are trying to adopt the value or live by the value of being culturally relevant, that you ought to ask yourself the question, what is a person far from God, what are they going to feel and what are they going to experience when they walk in the doors of our church?
Yeah.
And is it going to be something that they feel they're totally unrelatable to and totally foreign, or is it going to be something that is they can go, you know what, this identifies with my life? Because here's what we do know. We know that a lot of the basic struggles and needs that people have are the same today as they were, as they are in any culture or at any time.
Yeah.
And so the problems are the same, but how we go about helping people connect to the answer to their problems has got to be, because the world is constantly changing, we've got to be constantly evaluating our methods.
Yeah. Which, Ken, really speaks to the genius of what Jesus did, because it is a timeless message, a timeless strategy, a timeless methodology in a changing world. And the local church, I believe, I think what you're saying is we've got to think of everywhere as a mission field.
We do, whether you're going across the world or across the street.
That's right.
Yeah, that's
right.
good.
And so we've got to really start to maybe think and evaluate about the values of our church. And on this one we've been talking about.
You know, Ron, there are some things that are, that are part of my upbringing that I'm so thankful for. Yeah. I mean, some of the great hymns, some of the music, some of the traditions that I grew up in, man, I'm so thankful for.
Sure.
But here's what I can tell you, is that I make a mistake when I sanctify the method rather than sanctifying the message. And so
that's good.
So I've got to remember that the methods change.
Right.
The message never changes.
Yeah, that's good.
And so in order to get that message to people that are dying and going into eternity without Christ, man, I got to be willing to change the beat of a song or go from a suit to a dress shirt or something like that. I just got to be willing to sanctify the right things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But never compromising the truth.
Absolutely not.
Never compromising the truth.
Absolutely not.
So
yeah,
that's a good word. And
this is a big topic.
It is. So here's what we'd encourage you to do is share this, like this, start a discussion down below. We'd love to reach out to you if you agree or even disagree. We would love to have that conversation with you. At Impact Ministries, we really do want to come alongside the local church and have those hard discussions, maybe even talk about the values of your church, maybe even help you figure out what it means to be a disciple-making church. A couple ways you can do that. You can actually call us up. We'll do a consultation over the phone. We'll actually come and actually do that in person as well. And then we also have some online resources that you can actually watch some things, some teaching from Ken. You'll be able to see some of these video blogs as well. But we also have something for pastors and, for leaders as well, but it's called the Disciple Making Pastor. We have one actually starting on October 4th. Lance Sumner will be teaching that.
It's an online
equipping
group.
Yes, 7 weeks, and it's a little bit of homework, not a lot.
Yeah.
But it's just an amazing time for a pastor to really evaluate what it means to be a disciple-making pastor and leader. And we also have something pretty amazing coming up. I know it's next year, but it's coming fast.
It's just a few months away,
Just
really.
a few months away, but Disciple Making Summit is going to be on January 26th and 27th of 2024.
Yeah.
You don't want to miss it.
You don't want to miss it.
It's an amazing time. Already be thinking about your teams there. But thank you so much for joining us again. You don't want to miss any of the episodes coming up as we talk about church values. And if we can be any help to you, yes.
And you can find everything at Impact.
That's right. ImpactDisciples.com. So click on that. You'll see some links below as well. Once again, thanks for coming. And Ken, thank you for some good insight today into this. And
Thanks, Ryan. Good discussion.
We'll see you next time.